Hello, guys. Today I want to reflect on the moral nature of the state. Is the state a moral entity? Can the state kill? Can it commit murder? Can the state steal? I think that most people conceive of the state as a moral entity, although they might not admit it, it's somehow unconscious. Because a moral entity is someone who bears moral responsibility, someone who can be subject to moral criticism. And we all, at some point in our lives, we criticize the state on moral grounds. And this tells us that we conceive of the state as a moral entity. And if we agree that the state is a moral entity, that means that we agree that the state can commit an ethical violation. We agree that the state can commit murder, for instance. You can probably think of an instance where the state killing will be murder. Okay, and if the state can steal, I think this food for thought for our communist friends who argue that the state should requisition all property. Because if the state can steal, I cannot think of a clearer definition of theft than that. But we often talk as if the state was not a moral entity. For instance, if someone makes a moral objection, for instance, if I talk about freedom of speech and I point to someone whose freedom of speech the state is encroaching upon, someone always comes by and be like, uh, there's nothing called total freedom of speech. That in a civilized society, in a democracy, we have to consent to losing some of our rights. Okay, that the states will inadvertently encroach on our rights. If you were talking about freedom of property, or yeah, the right to own property, and I point out a case where the state is encroaching on somebody's right to property, someone always comes around and be like, well, there's nothing called total freedom of property, no total right to property. In a civilized society, we need the state to sometimes encroach on a right to property. Now, these two things are actually true, but it is a problem because it cannot be an argument for every single encroachment. Like the state's ability to encroach on our property, the state's ability to limit our speech cannot be unlimited. And so you cannot always rely as the argument against moral criticism of the state's encroachment on rights. Uh, so apart from stating the obvious, apart from stating that the state sometimes needs to do this, you have to justify why in that instance it is important for the state to do that. So the state is a moral entity, and if it's a moral entity, it means that it has to be undergirded by moral principles. When we talk about taxation, for instance, we will all agree, or most people will agree, that there are certain kinds of taxation that will be wrong. So if the state were to just tax the poor and give tax cut to the rich, so like that's the thing we see on TV all the time, the argument we see on TV all the time. That's because we recognize that there's something wrong with that. So the state's ability to tax people is not unlimited. It's not arbitrary. The state cannot come up with arbitrary rules for taxation. It has to be undergirded by moral principles, and that's why it is fair. It's a fair argument. It is a fair argument to point out that requisitional property, for instance, will be theft. Um, the second trap we fall into once we recognize that the state is a moral entity is to begin to think that the state is a moral entity, the same kind of moral entity as a human being. Okay, because we see things that are ethical violations for a human being, and we conclude that they must be ethical violations for the state too. And this is a trap we fall into. So, for instance, using the taxation as an example, for instance, there are those who would argue that taxation in itself is theft. Okay, all taxation is theft. And how they do this would be to say that to take a person's property by force is theft. Okay, and so when the state does it, it's also theft. Uh, you can see the argument also when people argue against the death penalty. They'll be like, killing is immoral. Okay, when a person kills, it's immoral. So when the state does it, there's no moral distinction to be made. murder is still murder. Killing is immoral. I think that this assumes that the state and the individual are the same kind of moral entity. And again, even though we are assuming it in this case, we actually don't believe that, because we can always think of examples of or scenarios where the state's jurisdiction or the state has a wider range of actions it can commit that will not be ethical violations. For instance, if I were to take somebody up and lock them in my basement, uh, that will be kidnapping without their consent. Okay? But we can see that there's nothing wrong when the state imprisons somebody. It's not kidnapping in that sense. So the state and the individual are not the same kind of moral entity, and we cannot judge moral violations based on what we think are wrong for individuals to do. So it's important to understand, this is the takeaway, that the state is a moral entity, but it's not the same kind of moral entity as the individual. And this enables us to have discussions about lots of stuff. Okay, because we cannot go to the extreme and allow the state unlimited power to do whatever it wants, but we can not also limit the state with uh, uh, our own narrow moral limits. Thank you very much.